the on-chain ecosystem really needs developer tooling. It needs infrastructure that is reliable. My name is Matt Madano. I'm building Arch. Now, so Arch is ultimately bringing a more programmable layer to Bitcoin, where Bitcoin has historically lacked or chosen to leave behind a more expressive world that can be a variety of different things for different people within the on-chain economy. Bitcoin's the most widely accepted and most in-demand crypto asset that's ever existed, but it doesn't do more of the things that we've become more familiar with on chains like Ethereum and Solana. That was really rooted in its priority to security, uptime, rather than things like yield. And then that's really where Ethereum came in and filled that void that utilized blockchain technology and distributed infrastructure to ultimately bring this whole DeFi ecosystem. But rather than build it around sound money, which is what Bitcoin is, they tried to create money with that infrastructure, which is, it has failed to justify itself as, sound digital currency, where Bitcoin has obviously, reached that scale and that level of acceptance worldwide. So a couple of years ago, there was an upgrade to Bitcoin where we can now put data on Bitcoin, which is really the root of programmability, to be able to differentiate these digital assets in order to do more complicated logic. Through that Taproot upgrade, now we have the ability to open up the design space and attempt to fill that void that Bitcoin intentionally left behind before. Figuring out the right way to bring programmability, and then by extension of that, a programmable DeFi economy that revolves around Bitcoin, that's what we call Bitcoin-denominated worlds. And this is probably where things will start, and eventually it'll work its way out into the real world where we can actually do more interesting things like paying with Bitcoin and using it in society. But for now, the on-chain ecosystem really needs developer tooling. It needs infrastructure that is reliable to build these more programmable applications that can tap into the wealth and distribution that Bitcoin ultimately brings. On Ethereum, you have a VM, obviously, that handles a lot of this smart contract logic. There is no VM on Bitcoin. It doesn't have a Turing-complete language that developers can utilize to build these more complicated protocols. It has Bitcoin script, which is much more, primitive and lacking in terms of its expressivity. You have to think what Bitcoin is lacking in order to actually build something that is going to be a long-lasting contribution to its, role in, the digital economy. Ultimately, what Arch is bringing are those missing pieces of infrastructure where we built a VM specifically for Bitcoin. We've built this cryptographic multi-sig that emulates smart contract controlled wallets, which are absolutely essential to pool-based infrastructure on Ethereum and Solana. So ultimately, Arch is bringing those missing elements so that developers can use Bitcoin as rails to build, smart contracts and applications around it. So historically speaking, you'd have to use, an EVM L2 or something like, or an EVM type of, roll up that is a Bitcoin L2, which obviously anybody can fork a Uniswap smart contract and then you can go and deploy on something like that. That really was challenging to tap into the liquidity on Bitcoin because that's really where a lot of the user friction lies and the lack of trust that Bitcoiners have in giving up the keys to their assets. That was really a non-starter for us when we, decided on how we were going to go about building Arch and enabling developers with the tooling that they needed to build something that users wanted to use. So first, bridging. Second, programmability was always a non-starter. Second to that is, obviously when building out an entire ecosystem, you're building out an economy at the end of the day. You need lots of different support systems in place, whether that's funding support, marketing support, as well as just general direction and advice when it comes to how to build something that also is a contribution to the space. Bitcoin has historically been known as like digital gold, which I think first and foremost, gives it an appealing factor, right? Because gold's great to have for a store of value. But what it also implies is that it's slow and clunky and very difficult to use at scale, right? It's not meant for the digital economy. It's just a store of value. Recognizing that and also like seeing what attempts have been made in, previously for making Bitcoin a little faster or more programmable, like the Lightning Network did and other L2s like Stacks, we realized that we have to build these rails, this infrastructure to support Bitcoin, how people want to use it. You have to go to Ethereum's like Ethereum and Solana to take some inspiration and see what's worked and what hasn't worked. But at the end of the day, we're trying to make Bitcoin much more consistent to use as a digital asset, where it's a little bit more difficult to build around. You have the mempool, which is a little bit of a free for all based on the fee market, which is difficult to build applications around with that type of unpredictability. Also, the speed with in which Bitcoin works at 10-minute plus block times usually. So that's very difficult to build DeFi applications, and by extension also like payment infrastructure, which requires near instant finality, if not instant finality. Looking to ecosystems like Solana for inspiration, that's really what Arch really set out to do, because I think Solana is definitely winning this debate on how to scale digital infrastructure with a monolithic approach, as opposed to this more modular approach that Ethereum went with. And there's a lot of value leakage that happens throughout that, and a lot of fragmentation. So going back to first principles and figuring out exactly what the most reasonable implementation to build a digital economy around Bitcoin, so that can tap into it and build more yield generating protocols, and making the asset more productive in general, as in addition to making it more performant and more usable in the real world. We just want to work with good builders, like ones that are trying to build something that's a lasting contribution, recognizing the opportunity that's at hand. This is unprecedented times where we're able to build a fresh ecosystem around the most, valued and in demand and distributed crypto asset on the planet. And if you go back to the, early days of Ethereum, that's really what accounted for a lot of the rise in its value, right? So if Bitcoin's already worth over $100,000 today, with ETFs and countries and Fortune 500 companies that are starting to put it on its balance sheet, that's a lot of Bitcoin that's in demand and being fought for. So now take into consideration how much Bitcoin is going to be in demand when you have an entire DeFi ecosystem, which accounts for a large percentage of Ethereum's supply is sucked up into leveraged DeFi, and then stablecoin asset issuance really followed from that. So I think that there's a huge opportunity, unprecedented opportunity for quality builders that know how to build scalable applications and know how to growth hack and really take advantage of these new opportunities and new ecosystems. And that's who we want to back, and that's who we want to support. We've been really fortunate to have a lot of inbound interest from builders because of some of our investor partners, and frankly, the technology is quite interesting as opposed to some of the more copy-paste stuff that you see out there. We've had the luxury of being able to kind of cherry pick and hand select the best builders that we think are going to build the next blue chip unicorns in the crypto space, right? So the type of support that we're ultimately offering is we'll provide our own engineering resources to take the time and help you build your applications. We take your feedback very seriously, because rather than going with a more wide net and volume approach and hoping that somebody wins, we're putting much more concentrated support behind these teams, so we have the ability to share in the resources that we have. We raised a bunch of money from our great investor partners, and a lot of that, a lot of those resources are being used to back these founders, not just with our time, but also with investment. We invest in these teams with their own cash. We have an ecosystem fund as well that also invests in the projects that we're extremely aligned with. And we want to continue to do that, because that's what we know is ultimately going to make the ecosystem more successful. Our success is their success, and we want to be as aligned as possible with them. And we think that that's the right approach, right? There's a lot of other mercenary builders out there that are just going where there's grant money, or going where it's the easiest to build. But the best builders are looking at our ecosystem right now, and they're taking the opportunity of running with it. And we're ready with support for those types of builders. What's most interesting about this unprecedented opportunity on Bitcoin is not just to create value, but it's also to make the existing value more productive. The grace land for everyone at this point seems like it's yield on Bitcoin, because we've already established you want to hold it, you want to continue to stack sats, but how do you actually make it more productive and earn yield? And historically, that yield is somewhat fake to a certain degree. It's a lot of this inflationary points and token airdrops and of other protocols and networks that are just incentivizing you to park that Bitcoin, in that protocol, but it's not actually generating any value. It's not earning yield in any type of way like Ethereum and Solana and stablecoins are able to do, because they're the in-demand asset for the ecosystem that they belong to. Then there's other protocols that are starting to emerge, like Babylon, which is now utilizing Bitcoin as a economic security asset for other proof of stake networks that need to utilize value for securing their networks. The next iteration or next phase is really going to revolve around building a Bitcoin-denominated DeFi ecosystem, which turns Bitcoin from a reserve asset and into the demand asset that you need to trade and need to capitalize on arbitrage and liquidation events that you only really have come to be familiar with in other more programmable ecosystems. With the emergence of programmability, like what Arch is doing, now we can actually build these applications that are denominated in Bitcoin. So that's what users need to trade. And based on demand, that's yield follows, right? Because you always have a borrower that's willing to pay interest, and that's truly sustainable. Points farming, and these inflationary incentives that subsidize the yield is not sustainable. So what I think is going to be very interesting from the Arch ecosystem is truly sustainable forms of yield, and actually quite attractive, yield, because it's coming from borrowers who are trying to trade. One of the major initiatives that we've been trying to tackle is make Bitcoin more productive within everyone's everyday life. And that can mean spending it as an asset when you're, just transacting at the store using a debit and credit card that links up to a wallet that connects to your Bitcoin that can ultimately be liquidated whenever you choose to sell it. There's also Bitcoin-backed mortgages now that are going to be going live on Arch mainnet, where anybody can get a mortgage with their Bitcoin as sort of hybrid collateral, which is sort of first of its kind. You'll be able to trade tokenized securities and RWA assets with Bitcoin and basically never have to enter, the more traditional finance world, and you can remain with your Bitcoin there. And then how companies can ultimately use Bitcoin to manage cash flow management and stuff like that. And there's applications within the commercial world that are quite exciting as well. So there's going to be a variety of things that you can initially do when Arch goes live with Bitcoin. But the beauty is just like Bitcoin is choose your own adventure already. It's freedom to do whatever you want with it. The developers within the Arch ecosystem and see some type of idea or use case for their Bitcoin, they can build it, because we're providing the permissionless infrastructure for them to build different types of applications, whatever they really want to.